Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. In Season 7, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneur mindset and drive. On this episode, we are joined by the Honourable Colin Deacon. His entrepreneurial background brings a unique perspective to Canada's upper chamber. Before his June 2018 appointment to the Senate as an independent senator representing Nova Scotia, Senator Deacon spent much of his career turning ideas into organizations, products, and services that improve lives. In this episode, Scott and Colin will discuss ways to build a more entrepreneurial government.
We are very excited to have Senator Deacon on the Venture for Canada podcast this afternoon. Senator Deacon, how are you doing?
I'm great, Scott, and really glad to be chatting with you as a fellow Nova Scotian and somebody who I really admire for what you've done in creating Venture for Canada.
Well, we are super excited to have you on the podcast, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you for many years. It's probably been approaching 7 years, and knowing you from your time at Blue Light and then from being appointed to the Senate. It's been a true pleasure. You've been a great friend and champion of VFC for many years and a former employer of many Venture for Canada fellows. And one of the things I really admire about you, Senator Deacon, is your experience as a very entrepreneurial public servant in Canada. And one of the things I've watched in your career in the Senate is you are incredibly entrepreneurial. You're working on a wide range of issues, be it on the environment or on competition, on economic development policy, so many different things that you're involved in and collaborating with people across the political spectrum. So what advice, let's say you're talking to somebody who's just been appointed to the Senate of Canada. They're starting in their new role on June 1st, 2022. What advice would you give that person on how to be an entrepreneurial senator?
Well, the thing is, the key is to be involved as deeply as you can in one or two issues in your first period in the Senate. Really focus in on one or two things and figure out how to use this new, very unusual responsibility in a way that where it really fits with your personality. Because we've got a tremendous opportunity with the responsibility. We've got three things that we're supposed to do. We're supposed to help with legislative review of government legislation that makes it through the House of Commons, or legislation that originates in the Senate. So we've got that responsibility. We have the responsibility of investigating. So when we look at legislation, we do a committee review and we dig into the issues and try and find areas where there's disagreement and understand why there's disagreement. We also do studies unrelated to legislation on a topic. For example, you and I have spoken about open banking in the past, which I spent a lot of time on, and that was where I got my first really big opportunity to understand what this role was all about, is to pursue the approach of bringing greater competition to the provision of financial services in Canada. And it's called open banking. It exists in so many other jurisdictions, and Canada wasn't making progress. And I'm really excited that we are now. Great that the government has embraced it finally. So that investigative role, we started in the Senate on that topic. And people think lots of senators are old and stodgy, and fair enough. Maybe I am, but our senators all said this is an urgent issue for Canada. That wasn't where they started. They were not keen on the topic at all. They didn't want to change anything with the banking system. But in the end, they fully embraced it. And I'm so proud of how hard my colleagues worked to understand the issue and the opportunity. And the last job we have is to represent. So legislate, investigate, represent. And represent, for me, I decided I represent entrepreneurs. Yes, province of Nova Scotia, for sure. But entrepreneurs and innovators, and making sure that they have the opportunity to really have the challenges that they're facing being heard in Ottawa and in the legislative process. So that's, for me, I really encourage new colleagues to just find those one or two topics, one or two projects they really love, they really are passionate about, where they think they can offer some value, and dig into it and try and understand your new job from that perspective. What can you do? How do you use the Library of Parliament? How do you use a parliamentary budget officer? to help you on an issue? How do you speak to the issue with your colleagues, or maybe get it studied in an issue studied in committee? It's always easier for me to learn through doing.
Experiential learning. That's what Venture for Canada is in the business of, and it applies to fostering entrepreneurs, but also for politicians as well. So on the topic of entrepreneurs, one of the things that's been interesting, we've been following at Venture for Canada, is that according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, aka the OECD, Canada is projected to have the lowest economic growth rate over the next 10 years of different OECD members. And one of the things that I'd say is increasingly talked about in Canada is growth as a mantra, that in the last couple of months, and it was certainly a signature of the 2022 federal budget, is how do we get Canada's economic growth back on check? How do we ensure that Canada isn't falling behind when it comes to economic growth, particularly in context of the United States and other developed economies? So Senator Deacon, what do you believe are the largest impediments to Canada's economic growth, and why are we trailing so many countries around the world?
We've got tremendous research capacity in this country. We're great inventors. We've got a great history of invention. The platform upon which the mRNA vaccines are built is a Canadian invention. I mean, we are great inventors in medical research and engineering, phenomenal. We're not great innovators in terms of applying those inventions into growth industries. So why is it that innovation and that we've got this Innovation Canada, and we've got invest all this money in research and development and in helping businesses to grow, but we're still not getting that traction in terms of productivity growth? And to me, there's a couple of factors, but the biggest one is we do not integrate our inventive and innovative capacity into our economy. Our regulations don't change too often to accommodate a new way of doing things. We have the most command and control regulations. We've got a very high regulatory burden in Canada. And I'm not saying to deregulate, I'm just saying we've got to get smarter about this. But we have the most command and control regulations of any country in the OECD, which means we define the process by which you must follow to deliver a certain service or product to the public. Well, that eliminates the opportunity to innovate in that industry. If you're defining the process, what we should be doing is defining the outcome. You must achieve this outcome. You must guarantee these factors are dealt with in order to, to live up to the regulations. So we have regulations that are very burdensome and very controlling, not a good thing. We have a procurement process that is managing risks so intently that actually, I think, quite often creates it. So, you wouldn't have the Phoenix payroll system problem in Ottawa if we did a good job of managing risk, right? It would not happen, because it would have been phased in a way that they would have found the problems early on in one department or one division of the department versus when the whole federal government was all on the same payroll system. So, how we do procurement, we don't integrate in innovation into that process. And it tends to be not innovative young Canadian companies that get procurement assignments. It tends to be large multinationals. And the last bit is that we do not manage competition or policies and programs and regulations that potentially are anti-competitive. We don't manage that very well in Canada. So we have a lot of oligopolies that are working in conscious parallelism. That's not colluding. That's just they just think the same way, and they do things the same way along the same lines. So we've got it in the telco industry, we've got it in the airline industry, we've got it in the banking industry, we've got it in the food sector. There's just a lot of oligopolies. And so there's not room, and sometimes a heavy regulatory burden is like a barrier to entry. Right? You've got to be a certain size to manage that heavy regulatory burden. So it prevents new entrants from coming into industries that are dominated by some really big incumbents. So that's why, those are sort of some of the reasons why I think we really have a challenge around growth in this country, productivity growth in particular. And if we don't manage those issues well, it will be increasingly affecting the prosperity of our children and grandchildren.
On the topic of financial regulation, I've spoken in the past with Andrew Chow, who's the founder of Neo Financial and also a past founder of Skip the Dishes. And he's talked about their challenges with banking licenses. I had no idea of how complicated it is to get a banking license in Canada. And he's saying it takes 4 or 5 years. And It's very different than the United States, where he said it's also hard to get a banking license, but it's a lot easier just to buy a small financial institution and get their banking license. Versus in Canada, there are so few banking licenses that exist that it becomes almost impossible to buy a banking license, because it's like, unless you're very deep pocketed, you're not going to be like buying National Bank just for their banking license, or buying a significant sized credit union. So it was fascinating kind of talking to him. That being said, I saw last week that they announced they raised $300 million. They have 650 employees. By the way, Venture for Canada was a very early employer partner, and they've hired dozens of people through Venture for Canada in the past. And yeah, I've known Andrew since actually he was just starting the company. So can you describe for our listeners, Senator Deacon, a little bit about what is open banking? Because I think it's a term that's widely talked about, but it's something that a lot of people can't really define like in a succinct way. And how specifically does open banking impede Canada's economic growth?
The lack of it impedes our economic growth. So what it is very simply is that it's your data rights. You should have the ability to use your financial data the way you want to use it. So if the bank isn't providing you value from your data and helping you understand your spending more clearly, or reduce the cost of the borrowing that you're doing more effectively, then the bank should be allowing you to transfer your data to a third party safely and securely, so that they can help you understand how to improve your credit score, reduce the cost of your borrowing, understand what you're spending money on, so that you can maybe budget more easily. It's giving you access to those third party SaaS providers, software as a service providers, that can allow you to learn from your data in ways that makes your life better. Invest better. I mean, you won't get many investment firms that will deal with anybody with less than $250,000. So with those with less than $250,000, what are they supposed to do? Do all their investment on their own, or go to somebody like Wealthsimple, who then can use algorithms to help them get the best tools that are suited to their risk tolerances and their needs as an investor. So it's about giving you access to these great AI tools that are being created left, right, and center, to watch over. Like, my kids can start watching over me to make sure that I don't end up getting caught in some sort of fraud scam. Wait, why is dad sending $5,000 to somebody in the Middle East for whatever? That doesn't make any sense. And there could be a check and balance there. Or why is he buying a few $1,000s worth of Bitcoin and sending it wherever? Elder fraud is a massive issue. Well, we can stop it at the source. It's using digital tools. So that's open banking is just that, and it's that for individuals and small businesses. And if you think about lending, for example, the way we evaluate risk right now is absolutely terrible for those who are marginalized. And so the Philadelphia Fed did a study showing how financial technology lenders, the lenders that use algorithms to assess risk based on your payment schedule, based on your financial data, could find within the uncreditworthy population, I put that in quotes, they found invisible prime borrowers, people who would not renege on their debts, that were very reliably paying their debts on time. But they, according to the credit scores, were uncreditworthy, right? So but it looked at the facts of the system based on what their payments history were. So this is about reducing the barriers to marginalized and racialized Canadians, and giving them access so that their actual data can drive decision making on the financial institutions, not tradition.
Is there any country around the world that you think Canada should particularly look at when it comes to open banking regulations?
I think the obvious one is the UK. They've got the most experience, but I'd say Australia is really they've had a rough first start. But we are going to have a made in Canada solution, I believe, that is driven by a really phenomenally well-run consultation process by Finance Canada. I was deeply impressed. I sat through every minute of the 15 hours of consultations, 5 3-hour sessions. It was really good. They went, looked at each issue from a variety of angles, had incumbents and new entrants there. Very well done, came out with a great report to Minister Freeland. And she pulled the trigger on the report, hired an open banking lead to implement the report. And it's now finally underway. Took about 3 years longer than I would have liked, but hey, it's happening.
On the topic of oligopolies within the country and the importance for a less risk aversion amongst regulators, we talked at the beginning of this conversation about how to be an entrepreneurial politician. How do you think Canada can foster entrepreneurial regulators?
We have to, number one, put in the list of responsibilities of our regulators that they must embrace innovation. And I want to then watch for demonstrations of that. I think they should be going to incubators and accelerators and talking to people in the space that they regulate and find out what new entrants are doing and find out the barriers they're experiencing to getting in to deliver greater customer value, greater customer safety and security using a different approach than has been traditionally offered. But we've got to get the innovators closer to the regulators, and we have to have the regulators go at it with an open mind to say, I'm not going to just teach you how to follow the regulation. I'm going to work with you to understand that and articulate clearly what the purpose of the regulation is and see if there are different ways that we can achieve that end together.
There are probably few countries in the world where telecommunications regulation is as controversial as Canada. We recently interviewed John Nubley, who's the former Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, and one of the longest serving deputy ministers who retired a few years ago. And he kind of laughed when I asked him this question about telecommunications regulation. And he said it's probably one of the things that's been most divisive among civil servants over the last sort of 20 years working in the innovation space in Canada is whether there needs to be more telecommunications, national telecommunications providers. So, Senator Deacon, do you think that the regulatory framework needs to change when it comes to telecommunications? Do you think the industry should be opened up and that there should be more competitors?
The answer may not be as clear as you'd like on this one. But because I know we've got to stop doing what we're doing. Last year, we had the head of the CRTC say, we need more competition in telecommunications. And so described a list of packages that they wanted, that the CRTC wanted the telcos to offer, and the date by which they're to offer them, and the price they're to charge. Now, that isn't how you create competition. What is the right, you don't create competition by defining what everybody's selling for what price by what date from a central federal regulator. But what is the right number? It's more than what we have right now. And I'm interested that the competition commissioner has just blocked, said they're going to fight the Rogers Shaw merger. That'll be interesting to watch that go along. The right number is more than what we have right now in my mind, because when you've got too many similar competitors, the conscious parallelism element takes over. They just start walking in unison. And I don't believe it's collusion. I just believe they just start walking in unison. And you need disruptors. If you are not disrupting an industry, it will be disrupted eventually. And that's not good for our economy to be at the disrupted end of that divide. We want to be on the disruptor end. And it's better it brings more security to our major incumbents. If they're constantly being threatened, it makes them work harder, fight harder, that deliver greater customer value. So you want to always have competitive threats being entering into a system. You don't want organizations to get too comfortable. So it's the numbers more. How much more? I don't know.
It's good to keep the incumbents on their toes. I know there's still a lot of people in Canada who will sometimes complain about Air Canada, but I remember as a child 20 years ago flying, and I would say that the experience of flying today is a lot more consumer centric. That being said, it's not perfect. And that's probably partly a consequence of the fact that even though Canada's aviation sector still is relatively oligopolistic, it's a lot less so than it was 2 decades ago. One other topic related to the innovation agenda that I think it's really interesting to explore with you, Senator Deacon, is that of the link of real estate and prices and innovation. And you live in the Halifax Regional Municipality, which has had some of the most significant real estate price inflation of any place, not just in Canada, but the world over the last 2 years ago. You're seeing houses that would have sold $450,000 3 years ago. They're now selling for $800,000. The level of price inflation in Halifax is pretty remarkable. So do you think that the level of real estate price inflation across Canada, not just in Halifax, or not just in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, but also in Halifax, in London, Ontario, and a lot of mid-sized cities across the country, including Charlottetown, where you spent many years as well. Do you think that that poses a systemic risk to Canada's economy and to our future economic growth as a country?
People who rent, we're seeing people being thrown out of apartments that they have been lived in for years and years. Rent evictions, right? It is. I just cannot imagine how some families and individuals are dealing with the fear of losing or ending up losing a place to live that is affordable, and being unable to maintain their job because they can't live close enough to work in order to carry on. So that to me is like, that's deeply upsetting. But I don't think bubbles like this can be maintained. And I lived in Toronto in the 80s when the same thing happened. In a very short period of time, prices went crazy. They peaked in 89, and it took a decade for them to get back up again. They dropped to about half in some categories of the value of 1989 by the mid 90s. And it took till 1999 till Toronto real estate prices fully recovered. You have to have underlying income to support that increased asset price, especially if you've got rising interest rates at the same time, because somehow it's got to be afforded. And that's what worries me a bit right now in Nova Scotia. I just think we've got way ahead of ourselves. A lot of people moved east, which is wonderful. We had some of our biggest population increases, but our supply has not been increasing, and therein lies the problem. And the other element is we've had blind bidding, which I just think I just don't understand how blind bidding is something that is allowed in the real estate market. It doesn't exist in any other market, just about. And I just don't get why we do that in something that's so central to most people's financial well-being. So it worries me. I'm not a gambler, even though I've gambled with my career an awful lot in moving. Started as a stockbroker, worked in medical research commercialization for a long time. Then spell read for teaching teachers how to teach reading, and then dentistry with blue light. Clearly I couldn't keep a job, but the thing that I've loved about all these different careers is how much I've learned. But you also appreciate when you work in a lot of different sectors in a lot of different parts of the country, how close a lot of people are to not being able to financially survive independently. And that's what worries me right now about the housing bubble. If interest rates keep rising because of inflation, I really worry about the effects it's going to have on an increasing number of Canadians, and in our part of the world where incomes are not rising at that rate, not anything close to it.
What do you think the government of Canada should be doing to address Canada's housing bubble?
That's a hard one. I mean, I think it really is. It's more. I think there's got to be more effort put into increasing supply. I think it's a provincial issue, but we've got to get rid of blind bidding. There is not fairness and equity in at the consumer level in terms of how they're involved, how they're buying and selling in the marketplace. And I just think we've got to really look and say, how are there some new tools that could be brought to bear to bring a lot more transparency to the process. I mean, we have Viewpoint in Nova Scotia that you're aware of, Scott, that certainly gives us more transparency than just about any other jurisdiction in the country. In terms of, you learn a lot about what's past sales that are on a house. You can do all that research on your own in Nova Scotia, which is great. but we've got to the actual transaction itself, we've got to bring more there. But supply is the big issue right now. We're bringing in a lot of new Canadians. You can't bring in all those new Canadians with a lower level of building of increasing supply and not have this problem get worse and worse and worse.
We're the fastest growing country as a percentage of our population within the G7, and we need the housing to keep up with the number of people. Senator Deacon, it's been a true pleasure. We've talked a lot about some of the threats facing the country. As a final question, what is one thing that particularly excites you about the future of Canada? What is one opportunity you think is particularly compelling for the future of our country?
We have got the most diverse population in the world, and we've got a number of things that we do incredibly well, and we serve a broad base of the public. One of them, we do have the basis of a good healthcare system. It's been blown to pieces through COVID. It's had the devastation that it's been wrought on most of our healthcare workers. It does make me mad about those who have been protesting against restrictions, because that selfishness doesn't take into consideration what our healthcare workers have gone through over the last 2 years. And I just can't believe how fortunate we are that many folks are sticking with it. But we've got a great opportunity around our healthcare data in looking at healthcare differently and saying, what can we do to export around the world Canadian learning and understanding around healthcare to help other countries do better, and ourselves as well. We've got great banks, well-respected banks. If we fintech enable those banks, we should be the dominant financial system for the world, as far as I'm concerned. Our food is trusted, our agricultural products are trusted. We've got to find a way to start to build our exports. And so I want to get to the final point that gives us that opportunity, is we've got the most diverse population with as many direct connections into every country in the world as any other country could possibly have. So why are we not the world's most aggressive exporter and trade relationship builder? We get deals in place, but we don't sell. We've had trade agreements with more countries in the world than any other economy in the world, but we do not take advantage of that in a way that is diversified. Our digital sales are still, for example, 65% to the United States. We're still US focused. So what gives me hope is that I think with our increasing diversity of our population, we're going to see an awful lot more focus on exporting to other countries in the world. And that diversity is going to be good for the world, and it's going to be good for Canada.
And if listeners are interested in another podcast episode where we're going to dive into this issue even more, we're excited to be interviewing Sarah Wilshaw, who is Canada's Chief Trade Commissioner, where we're going to be talking about how Canadian companies can export more globally. I also will give a plug for one book on the subject that is related to it, but a little different. Is John Stackhouse's Planet Canada, where he also talks about the importance of engaging Canada's diaspora. There's almost 4 million Canadians who live outside of the country. It's the equivalent of the population of Alberta. We are one of the most globally interconnected countries in the world. You go anywhere on this planet, there are Canadians. How do we better engage the diaspora? And there's lots of great examples, from Ireland to Israel to Singapore, you name it. There's a great opportunity for Canada to think more globally. Senator Deacon, it's been a pleasure getting to know you over the last 7 years. Thanks for all your support of Venture for Canada and for everything you do to foster a more inclusive, a more entrepreneurial, a more innovative, and a more prosperous Canada. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast this afternoon.
All right, right back at you, Scott. Thanks very much to you and for all you do. Thanks for having me on. I'm really honored.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture, 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture.canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sterrett and Colin Deacon. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah, and editing and mixing are also done by Latifa Farah. Basola Agamba is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast.